The weekend changed something fundamental, not just in Venezuela, but in how power is spoken, signaled, and used. When US forces seized Nicolas Maduro, it wasn't merely a strike, it was a message, and in the hours that followed, that message widened fast. From Caracas, it traveled north to Greenland, east to Iran, across borders to Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, different countries, different systems, but one unifying theme: American dominance will not be questioned. I want you to pause on that sentence, because it is not rhetorical flourish, it is a worldview. When a US president says, "We need Greenland," when he speaks of oil flowing freely, when he suggests military action with casual certainty, this is not improvisation. It is doctrine spoken out loud. If you want to understand where the world is heading, you need to understand what just began. Stay with me, because in the next part, we strip this down to its core logic, what is really being redefined and why it matters to you. And if this kind of analysis helps you see the world more clearly, take a moment to follow, share, or stay for what comes next. Look carefully at the pattern emerging here. This is not about one country, and it is not about one crisis. What we are witnessing is a deliberate widening of scope. Venezuela was the opening move, but immediately after, the language expanded to territory, to resources, to obedience, to deterrence. Greenland is framed not as a people, but as a strategic asset. Colombia not as a partner, but as a liability. Cuba as a regime ready to fall. Mexico as a corridor out of control. Iran as a line that must not be crossed. Each case is different, yet the logic is identical. The United States under Donald Trump is asserting something simple and blunt. Security justifies pressure, pressure justifies intervention, and intervention no longer needs permission. This is a break from ambiguity, a break from diplomatic subtlety. Power is being verbalized before it is exercised. And that matters, because once power is spoken this openly, others are forced to respond, not to actions, but to intent. To understand why this moment feels so volatile, we have to step back into history, cycles, and the deeper mechanics of American power. That's where we're going next. To understand this moment, you have to see it in historical motion. The United States has always oscillated between restraint and assertion, between being a system builder and a system enforcer. What you are seeing now is not new power, but old power, reactivated. After the Cold War, America wrapped dominance in institutions. NATO, trade rules, multilateral norms. Power was real, but it was mediated. Intervention came with language about order, values, consensus. That era is fading. In its place is a return to something more primal. Security defined geographically, resources defined strategically, and influence defined by who can say no and make it stick. Greenland suddenly matters because the Arctic is opening. Venezuela matters because oil still matters. Colombia and Mexico matter because borders still matter. Iran matters because deterrence still matters. This is the logic of great powers when they feel history accelerating. Not decline, but compression. Moments where leaders believe delay is weakness. And when that belief takes hold, language hardens, options narrow, and pressure becomes policy. That is why the next flashpoint was almost inevitable. Because once power shifts from quiet to explicit, crisis is no longer accidental. It becomes structural. Then came the first rupture. Not a warning, not a maneuver, a seizure. When Nicolas Maduro was taken by US forces, the shock was immediate, but the meaning ran deeper. This was not regime change by proxy, not sanctions, not isolation. This was physical intervention. And notice what followed. Not hesitation, not de-escalation, but expansion. Within hours, the rhetoric widened. to Colombia, described not as a sovereign state but as a narcotics threat. To Cuba, dismissed as a system ready to fall. To Mexico, framed as a breach point where something may have to be done. This is how crises cascade. One decisive act lowers the psychological cost of the next. Colombia's president spoke of taking up arms. Cuba vowed resistance at a heavy cost. Mexico reaffirmed a hard line against intervention. These were not diplomatic replies. They were signals of red lines being drawn in real time. If you're trying to understand why the temperature rose so fast, this is why. Because once force is normalized, every statement becomes a potential trigger. If this analysis is sharpening how you see these moves, stay with me. What comes next explains why this logic keeps repeating. What sits beneath all of this is a mechanism we rarely name, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is not chaos. It is coercive clarity. The Trump administration is stripping geopolitics down to first principles. Who controls territory? Who controls resources? Who can project force fast enough to deter resistance? Greenland is not discussed as a democracy. It is discussed as geography. Venezuela is not framed as a nation in crisis. It is framed as oil flow. Mexico is not treated as a partner. It is treated as a choke point. And when power is framed this way, dialogue becomes secondary. Threats are not a failure of diplomacy here. They are the tool. By speaking intervention aloud, before it happens, you reshape behavior without firing a shot. You unsettle governments. You test reactions. You force allies and adversaries alike to reveal their thresholds. This is why words matter so much in this moment, because rhetoric is doing strategic work. But this mechanism has a cost. Once fear replaces predictability, miscalculation becomes easier. And when multiple actors feel cornered at once, the system itself starts to shake. That tension is about to surface again more sharply, more dangerously. The second crisis doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives layered across regions, across signals, across red lines. Look at Iran. As protests spread, the warning comes fast. If people are killed, the United States is locked and loaded. Not metaphor, not ambiguity. And remember the context. Nuclear facilities were already bombed months earlier. Talks had already collapsed. Deterrence was already strained. Now add public threats on top of live unrest. This is how pressure compounds. Domestic instability meets external menace. Protest meets pride. And suddenly, restraint looks like surrender. At the same time, allies hear something else. If you are Denmark, watching Greenland discussed as a strategic necessity, if you are Mexico, hearing invasion floated as a solution, if you are Colombia, being described as a narco state, you start to ask a dangerous question. Are alliances conditional now? This is why the system feels brittle. Too many fronts, too much language, too little margin for error. The second crisis is not one event. It is the realization that escalation is no longer hypothetical. And once that realization sets in, everyone adjusts their posture, including you, because the consequences don't stay at the top. Now let me bring this closer to you, because when leaders talk about dominance, about security, about intervention, they are not talking in abstractions. They are talking about your world. If you live in Mexico, this sounds like sovereignty being questioned. If you live in Colombia, it sounds like dignity being reduced to a stereotype. If you live in Greenland, it feels like your identity is being flattened into coordinates on a map. If you live in Iran, it feels like your streets have become someone else's red line. And even if you live far from all of this, you still feel it. In energy prices, in markets that twitch at every headline, in the quiet anxiety that the rules you thought existed are being rewritten without your consent. You are not imagining the instability. This is what it feels like when power speaks louder than process. And here is the hardest truth. Ordinary people always absorb the shock first. If this analysis resonates, if it helps you name the unease you've been feeling, stay engaged, share it, keep watching. Because understanding is the first form of agency. And what happens next does not stop at borders. Zoom out now, because the real story is not regional. It is systemic. When Washington speaks this way, the world listens and recalibrates. In Europe, allies hear uncertainty where guarantees once lived. Denmark hears its sovereignty debated in strategic terms. NATO hears a question mark where consensus used to be. In Latin America, memories resurface. Intervention is not theoretical there. It is historical, and that history shapes how Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico respond firmly, publicly, defensively. In the Middle East, the signal is sharper still. Iran hears not just a warning, but a pattern. Pressure escalates before diplomacy has time to breathe. Others in the region draw their own conclusions about deterrence, alignment, and survival. And then there are China and Russia, watching Greenland, the Arctic, energy routes, and norms fracture in real time. They do not need to intervene. They only need to learn. This is how global systems shift, not through one war, but through repeated moments where rules bend and then break. The danger is not that power is being used. It is that everyone is adjusting to a world where power is all that speaks. And once that adjustment is complete, the future stops being predictable. That's where we go next. So where does this lead? There are three paths ahead, not predictions, scenarios. The first is stabilization through intimidation. The threats work. Governments pull back. Protests fade. Energy flows resume. Power reasserts itself. And the system settles uneasily but intact. History shows this can happen for a time. The second path is managed fragmentation. No single explosion, but constant friction. Allies hedge. Adversaries probe. Crises stay just below the threshold of war. The world becomes noisier, more transactional, less trusting. This is not collapse. It is erosion. The third path is escalation by miscalculation. A protest turns bloody. A warning is ignored. A move meant as deterrence is read as preparation. And suddenly, leaders are trapped by their own words. Because once you speak in absolutes, backing down becomes politically impossible. Which path emerges depends on restraint, not of power, but of language. Because language is now doing strategic damage. This is the paradox of dominance. The more openly it is asserted, the harder it becomes to control. And that brings us to the final question. Let me leave you with this. Power has always shaped the world, but how it is spoken has not always been the same. What we are seeing now is power without whisper, without euphemism, without the soft language that once slowed its momentum. When leaders say what they intend to do, when dominance is declared instead of implied, the system loses its shock absorbers. That doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. It means responsibility becomes heavier, because every word now travels faster than every missile. Every threat redraws expectations. Every escalation narrows the future. The seizure in Venezuela, the warnings to Greenland, the pressure on Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Iran, these are not isolated headlines. They are signals of a world testing how much force it can tolerate before it pushes back. And you are not a bystander to that test. You live inside its consequences. If you want to keep understanding how power is shifting, not just what happens, but why it happens, stay here, share this, follow the conversation. Because the next chapter of this story is already being written